Welcome to this YSL Excel VBA tutorial. This video is going to give you a brief introduction to working with dates in VBA. We're going to start with the absolute basics of both writing and reading dates in your VBA code, and explain how the regional settings of your computer can affect the display of those dates. We'll talk a bit about the date data type and the range of dates available to you when you're working in VBA dates, which is slightly different to the dates available to you working in Excel, so there are a few little things to watch out for there. We'll talk about how to get to the current date and the current time as well using VBA functions, before we move on to a quick look at formatting dates using a variety of functions and properties of cells as well. The last part of the video is going to talk about various calculations you can perform with dates, primarily working out the difference between two dates. We'll have a look at some of Excel's date functions and how you can access those in your VBA code, as well as some native VBA functions, before we finish off the video with a quick look at how you can calculate age in years accurately. So quite a bit to do here, let's get started. Okay, so I'm going to start this new video with a brand new blank Excel workbook. All I've done so far is saved it as a macro-enabled workbook with a new name called Dates in VBA. From here I want to head straight to the Visual Basic editor, and as always I can do that either from the Developer tab, clicking Visual Basic, or pressing Alt and F11 on the keyboard. Once I'm in the VB editor, I'm going to insert a brand new blank module, so as usual I can right click in the Project Explorer, choose Insert and then choose Module. I'm not going to bother renaming it, although we will end up with a few different modules in this workbook. All I'm going to do here is create a quick simple subroutine called Date Basics, and then explain some of the absolute basic principles of working with dates in VBA. Okay, so the very first thing I'd like to accomplish here is show you how to write date values into your VBA code, and also how to store those date values in variables. So let's start by declaring a variable to hold a date. I'm going to call mine something nice and short like dt, short for date, and then I'm going to assign use the data type, the only available data type for dates in VBA, which is called date. So date can hold both date values and date and time values. So date is the only available date-time data type in VBA. To assign a value to it, of course, just like any other variable, you would state the variable name followed by an equal sign. And what I'd like to do here is, let's say I want to assign today's date. So my system clock says it's the 2nd of May 2017. Just to reassure you, this is definitely the 2nd of May here. I'm using UK regional settings, so that's day, month, year for the basic standard date format, rather than so it's not February 5th, 2017, just in case you were wondering about that. So I'd like to assign today's date to that variable. To write date values in VBA code, you'll have seen this in a few previous videos in this series, but we use a set of hash marks to enclose dates. Just like you'd use double quotes to enclose strings, you use hash marks to enclose dates. So if I say 2/5/2017, close the hash marks, and that will assign that date value to that variable. All I'd like to do now is read that date value back out into various different places in my VB editor and Excel. So I've already got my immediate window displayed and the locals window, so I'm going to write a statement that will print it to the immediate window. We'll see it in the locals window when we step through the code. I'd also like to display it on a message box and also write it out into some cells in the worksheet. So in fact, let me make sure that I can see the worksheet. I'm just going to restore down my VB editor window. If you haven't got the immediate window and locals window displayed, then the view menu is where you'll need to go. So you'll see them both in the view menu. And all I'm going to do then is say debug.print dt. I'm going to say message box dt. And then I'm also going to say sheet1.range a1.value equals dt. So I'm going to write out that value into several different places. All I'm going to do then is step through this procedure using the F8 key, and hopefully you'll see when you first begin using the F8 key that the locals window displays the value of your datetime variable as effectively a time formatted value of 0. So if I were to use the F8 key to continue stepping through, I'll assign the value to my variable. Now you might already be able to notice, if you can squint, maybe you can just about read the font size in the locals window, you might already be able to see that we've got a small tiny little issue with what's being fed into that date variable. You see it switched from the 2nd of the 5th to 5th of the 2nd, 2017. If I carry on stepping through, I've printed out the 5th of the 2nd, 2017, and the message box shows me the 5th of the 2nd, 2017, and finally my worksheet shows me that indeed the 5th of the 2nd, 2017. Now because this is the original settings of my machine are set to be UK settings, then this definitely is being read as the 5th of February 2017. In fact, I can prove that just briefly if I were to format that single cell there with a a long date format instead. So you can clearly see that that's set to be the 5th of February, not the 2nd of May. So one small issue you're going to have, let's just reset this procedure first. One small issue you're going to have, if you live effectively anywhere except for the US, or somewhere that uses the US month, day, year, date format, then you're going to be in a little bit of trouble when you start writing date values into your VBA code. This is a problem that actually would have become more apparent had I been recording this video on any date after the 12th of the month. Let me just show you quickly what I mean by that. So currently it looks here to me as though I've typed in the 2nd of the 5th, 2017, 2nd of May. Had I typed that in as the 13th of May, 2017, as soon as I move away from that line, you can clearly see that the date format changes to month, day, year. The 13 can't possibly be anything other than the day of the month. So were I to run this procedure again, if I use the F8 key to step through again, you'll see this time that although it's displayed as month, day, year in the code that I've written, anything that displays the value back to me that uses my regional settings, such as the locals window, 13th of the 5th, and the immediate window, 13th of the 5th, and of course my message box, and of course sheet 1, range A1, 13th of May 2017. So if your regional settings are anything other than essentially the US month, day, year format, then you need to remember that when you write your dates into VBA, that it's month, day, year. Now, if like me you've been trained your entire life to write out your date formats as day, month, year, this can be quite a difficult thing to get used to. It's absolutely fine as long as you're typing in a date that's after the 12th of the month, but prior to that then it's very easy to accidentally write it out in your more familiar date format, day, month, year. So one way to mitigate that would be to enter your dates in a format that's completely unambiguous. So let's try to enter the 2nd of May again into this date. So I'm going to type in the number 2, but rather than putting in the number of the month, what I'm going to do is write out either the short or the long month name. So it just so happens that for May, the short name and the long name are exactly the same, but you could also have Jan or January, Feb or February, etc. So clearly the word May can't possibly be misinterpreted as the number of the day of the month. Sadly, when I click away from this line, all the date formatting changes again to go to month, day, year, but the number 5 has replaced the word May, but that's gone into the correct position. So that's one other way you could potentially prevent yourself from making mistakes. Type out the slightly longer date format with the name of the month. Next, let's have a look at the range of dates that you have available in VBA. This is another potential source of error if you're working with dates in VBA and Excel, because the range of dates available is different to both systems. Let's have another quick new subroutine here. Let's call this something like date ranges. And what I'd like to do here is have 3 separate variables, one to hold each date of the min and max for VBA's dates and the min date available in Excel. So I'm going to declare a variable called dmin as date, and I'll also have dmax as date, and let's also have dmin Excel. So that'll be Excel's minimum date, which is different, but that will also be stored as a date. What I'd like to do then is assign various values to these variables. So I'm going to do that by saying dmin first of all equals, and the earliest date you can possibly store in VBA's date system is the 1st of January 100. So I'm going to enter that as a date. I'm going to enter in a set of hash marks 1/1/100. It's impossible to put in a year earlier than the year 100 simply because if you try to type in 99, that's going to be interpreted according to VBA's date system as 1999, and you'll see that clearly when you move the cursor away. So 100 is the earliest year you can enter for dates in VBA. Dmax is actually the same as in Excel, so Dmax is equal to the 31st of the 12th. I should enter this, shouldn't I? Let me tell you what, let me enter it as 31 space dec or December 9999, and then that will be moved around again, of course, when I move the cursor to the next line, 12/31, so again, month, day, year. And that's the same as in Excel as well. The final date format or date value we're going to add in is for Excel's min date. So Excel doesn't actually store date time values earlier than the 1st of January 1900. So what we're going to do is say dmin Excel equals, and then we're going to enter into a set of hash marks 1/1/1900. Excel does actually have 2 separate date systems it can work with. It can either have 1900 as the earliest date or 1904, but the default setting is always 1900, so unless you've explicitly changed that, then 1900 should be the earliest date that Excel can use. Okay, what I'd like to do next then is simply display those values back to the end user. So let's display them, let's say on a message box, and also write them into new cells in a new worksheet. So what I'm going to do here is say message box, and then I'm going to say dmin with a VB new line character, and then dmax as with a VB new line character, and finally another ampersand and dminxl. So xl's minimum date, there we go. Then I'd simply like to add in a new worksheet and write out those three values into cells in the worksheet as well. We're going to encounter a problem with one of these, of course, but this is kind of the point of showing you this in the first place. So I'm going to say worksheets.add, and then I'm going to say range a1.value equals dmin, and then I'm just going to copy that line and paste it in a couple of times, then edit the code so that we can say a2 and a3, and then say dmax and then dminxl. Okay, so we're displaying the information on the message box and also writing it out into cells in the worksheet. I'm going to step through this one using the F8 key. So let's use the F8 key to begin stepping through, and you can see the three date variables have been populated with a default value of 0. And then we'll see that the values 1, 1, 100 and 31, 12, 99, 99 and 1, 1, 1900 gets entered into the locals window. If I display those on a message box, that's exactly what I get, 1st of Jan 100, etc, etc. And then finally, if I start writing these out into cells in a worksheet, now of course this one's going to fail because Excel can't accept a date time value of earlier than the 1st of Jan 1900. So if I hit F8 there, I'm going to get a runtime error. That was kind of expected. If I hit debug, what I can simply do is click and drag this yellow arrow just to skip over that line. Let's ignore that one for the time being. Then let's set the maximum date in there. So if we put the maximum date into cell B2, let's just zoom in so you can clearly see that. So that goes in as expected, 31st of the 12th, 99.99, and then finally range A3's value, the minimum value for Excel. So let's hit F8 to enter that, and then something goes slightly wrong. Something slightly strange happens. Rather than entering the 1st of Jan 1900, I get the 2nd of Jan 1900. Okay, so this is a little bit unexpected unless you're familiar with Excel's famous leap year bug. Let me see if I can try to explain what this is all about. Let's create another quick subroutine and let's have a name called something like leap year bug. And I'm going to declare a variable which can hold a simple date, so I'm going to say dim dt as date. And then I'm going to add in a new worksheet to write some values into, so worksheets.add. What I'd like to do is set dt to be equal to, and bear with me here, I'm going to set this to be the 1st of March 1900. So the date value I'm going to enter into there is 1 Mar 1900, and of course the formatting will then set itself according to the regional settings of your own VBA, which is always US, month, day, year. And then I'd like to write out into range A1 the value of that date. So I'm going to say range A1.value equals dt. What I'd then like to do is try to assign the value of 28th of Feb 1900. So I'm going to set this to be 28th of Feb 1900, and again that'll flip around into the 2/28 because 28 can't possibly be the month of the year, and then set that into range A2. Okay, so if I were to then use F8 to step through this, again unsurprisingly we should see, if I can just zoom in so you'll be able to see it a little more clearly, that first of all the 1st of March, rather than the 3rd of March, 1st of March, March 1st goes in there as expected. When I set the value to be the 28th of Feb, then although that's read into the locals window correctly, when it gets read into Excel itself, that's displayed as the 29th of Feb 1900. Well, that actually wasn't the 29th of Feb 1900. This is a deliberate bug that if you're interested in reading about, then there's a lovely, fascinating article about how Excel incorrectly assumes the year 1900 is a leap year. It was done deliberately to keep it in line with another competitor program at the time called Lotus 123. You may be familiar with that if you're incredibly old like me. But anyway, if you're interested, then that's why you get a slight discrepancy between VBA dates and Excel dates prior to the 1st of March 1900. Now hopefully, and I think it's probably fairly unlikely you're going to be using dates earlier than that date, this will only ever cause you a problem if you are comparing dates in VBA and Excel prior to the 1st of March 1900. If you're not going to be using dates like that, then you never ever have to worry about it. It's just a useless bit of trivia like many of the other things I show you in my videos, but it's certainly worthwhile being aware of just in case. Just to prove that VBA can't handle the 29th of Feb 1900, if you did try to enter the date February 29th, 1900, that will throw you a syntax error. You can't even execute the code. So VBA knows, but Excel clearly has this this little issue. So there you go, something not particularly interesting, but potentially useful if you encounter that problem yourself. Now, so far everything we've done assumes that you're going to be writing out your dates directly into your VBA code, but it's actually reasonably rare that you're going to be doing that. More commonly, you're going to be accessing your dates from cells in the worksheet, or from data imported elsewhere, or connections to databases, or even just using Excel's functions and formulae to calculate dates. One of the most common dates you're going to be interested in most of your calculations is going to be the current date, or today's date. Now, you may well be aware that you can calculate today's date in Excel worksheets simply by using the today function. So just to quickly demonstrate that, if I were to click into an Excel worksheet cell and say equals today, then I can close a set of parentheses. There are no parameters to the today function, and if I were to enter that, it will return today's date for me, formatted according to my regional settings, of course. So, to demonstrate or replicate the same sort of feature in VBA, let's have a new subroutine called current date, and then what I'd like to do again is declare that same variable dim dt as date, and then I would like to assign today's date to that variable. Now, the function for today's date in VBA is different to Excel's today function. The name of the function, confusingly, in Excel or in VBA that returns today's date is the same as the name of the data type. So dt equals date will store today's date. If I can just quickly demonstrate that by both printing it to the immediate window, if I say debug.print, and then let's also write that out into cell A5. So I'm going to say range A5 dot value equals dt. I should also say what I wanted to debug.print as well. I almost forgot there. I'm just going to clear the contents of the locals window, the immediate window first, and then if I use the F8 key to step through, somewhat unsurprisingly I get the 2nd of the 5th, the 2nd of the 5th, and of course the 2nd of the 5th, so exactly the same as the regional settings of my machine, so the 2nd of May, of course. Excel has another function which calculates both the date and the current time, so the function that does that is simply called now. If I typed into a cell in Excel again, if I said equals now, and then opened and closed some parentheses, that returns not just the date, but also the time at which I wrote or called the function. That will recalculate every time I do something else, or manually recalculate the worksheet. So just to demonstrate that that includes the seconds as well, I'm going to apply a quick custom number format to that cell. So I'm just going to display the format cells dialog box, and let's just add on the seconds by adding a colon SS to the end. So just to demonstrate that as I do other things, if I were to just use the F9 key to recalculate the worksheet, you'll see that it updates the value in that cell. If I were to type something into another cell, even just any old random bit of text, it doesn't really matter, that will force that function to refresh as well. So what I'm going to do next is replicate that same functionality in VBA. Well, not quite the full functionality, but at least the result of the now function. So what I'm going to do here is in the same subroutine as I used earlier, I'm going to say dt equals, and then VBA's function is actually called the same as Excel's function this time, so it's called now. And then once again, if I were to debug.print it and then change the value of a cell based on that as well, let me just copy and paste those two lines, and now let's say range A8.value equals dt. So were I to use the F5 key to run the entire thing, and then again I want to apply the same format to this cell so that I can see the seconds. So the simplest thing to do here is to use the format painter button to format that. I could have written some code to do the same thing, but we'll get onto formatting date shortly. So one thing that you'll be able to see hopefully from this, if I use the F9 key to recalculate my worksheet, is that once the now function has returned its result, because we're just passing the result of the function into the cell, not the actual formula itself, then that won't recalculate. So you can clearly see that if I hit the F9 key that it recalculates the now function, but not this. This is just a value, of course. Now, it is possible to write out values into cells in the worksheet using VBA where the date and time will be recalculated. So to do that, all we need to do is enter the actual functions into the cells rather than the results of VBA's date-time functions. Let's have a quick go at doing that. If I switch back to the VB editor, and let's have a new subroutine called something like enter date functions. So this time, rather than setting the values of the cells to be equal to the result of a function, I'm going to write out the function itself. So to do that, I'm just going to jump straight into the cell. I'm not going to bother using a variable this time. I'm not going to hold any results. I'm going to set the values of the cells to calculate the results. So I'm going to say range A10.value equals, and then in some double quotes, I'm simply going to write out the formula that I would write out to calculate today's date. So in Excel that would of course be the today function, not the date function. Same thing if I just copy and paste that line of code and then set range A11's value to be equal to the now function, not the result of the now function. And then as I said earlier on, let me just make sure that I can format the value of A11 so that it has the time component down to the seconds as well. So to do that I can say, let me just paste in what I just copied earlier on, and then I can take away the value property and use the number format property instead. So range A10.numberFormat equals, then in some double quotes I can write out my date format. So that would be dd/mm/4Ys followed by a space, then a couple of H's, a colon, a couple of M's, another colon, and a couple of S's as well. It was A11 I meant to do there, sorry, rather than A10, beg your pardon. So A11, the one that has the time component. Okay, so having done all that, let me just hit the F5 key to run the entire thing, and we will indeed end up with those values being entered into the cells in the worksheet. But if I switch back into Excel and I recalculate the worksheet again by using the F9 key, you'll see that this time the result of this cell updates as well. So it's exactly the same formula as I entered in manually. Okay, so on the subject of formatting dates, let's look at a couple of the things that you can do in VBA terms. So number format is a property of a range object in an Excel worksheet, of course, but there are several format functions available to you in VBA. Let's have a look at a couple of them. In fact, what I'm going to do at this time is insert a new module. So let's right click and insert a module, and let's have a new subroutine called something like formatting dates. Just for convenience, I'm going to declare a variable to hold today's date, so I'm going to say dim dt as date, and then say dt equals date, which will give me, of course, today's date. What I can do at that point is create a brand new worksheet, so I'm going to say worksheets.add, and then I'm going to set the values of a few cells to be equal to the results of formatted versions of today's date. So let's start with range A1, so I'm going to say range A1.value equals, and then I'm going to use the format date time function first of all. So I use the control space keyboard shortcut to display the IntelliSense. There's a function in there called format date time. So in there I have a variety of different parameters. The only compulsory parameter is the thing that I'm about to format, which is the value held in my dt variable. But then I have a variety of built-in date formats that I could choose to use. The first one I'm going to go for is the general date. So you'll see that that's the default anyway, so if I omit this parameter then I get a general date anyway, so let's put that one in there first of all. Then a quick case of copy and paste. So I'm going to copy and paste that a couple of times and say range A2, range A3, and then just take away the general date format, press control space again, and I've got long date, and then let's go for the other one, which was short date. I'm not going to bother with the time components. So long date and short date use the regional settings of my computer. Let's have a quick go. If I use the F5 key just to run that one as it stands, and then just make sure that I can increase the width of my column so you can see the results. So the general date format and the long date format and the short date format all conforming to the regional settings of my computer. Now, of course, that's a fairly limited list of date-time formats, as you might expect. You've seen that you can customize your date formats in Excel. You can actually do the same thing in VBA as well. So let's have another paste of that same line that I just copied. I'm going to say range A4.value this time, but rather than using the format date time function, what I'm going to do instead is use just the generic format function. So the format function doesn't use specific date formats like the list we've seen there, general date, long date and short date. What it does instead is allows you to enter your own custom date formats. So what I can do here is, in a set of double quotes, I can write out essentially the same sorts of date formats that we just saw in the number format property of a range object. But this time let's go for something a little bit more elaborate. I'm going to go for 4Ds, which will give me the name of the day of the week, followed by a single D, which will give me the number of the day of the month, another space, and then I'm going to have 4Ms, which will give me the full month name, followed by another space, and 4Ys, which will give me the year of the date as well. So having entered that, if I were to run that subroutine using the F5 key, and I'll end up with yet another new worksheet. I've got a few too many, but you'll see this time I get a slightly more expanded, more elaborate date format according to the format that I've typed in here. One thing worthwhile bearing in mind with the results of the format function is that the results might not always be a date. So this particular format function that I've used here to create this fairly elaborate date format has resulted in the value of the cell being treated as text. I can demonstrate the difference here actually. Let me just copy and paste that last line we've written together, and let's change the value of cell A5. And let's try to replicate the generic bog standard general date format. So I'm going to go for a couple of D's followed by a / and then a couple of M's and a / and let's go with 4 Y's actually. Okay, so if I were to run this subroutine again, then I'll end up with a new worksheet with those date values inserted. But hopefully what you can see from this, if I were to select that cell A4, it's got the general format, whereas I select cell A5, that's got the date format. It's also if I were to try to extract bits of one of these dates, let me just use something simple like the year function to try to extract the year from any of the dates we've just looked at there. If I enter the year function and then fill that formula down the column, I'll end up with, we'll end up with a value error next to this kind of more elaborate date format. It can't be treated or interpreted as a date. So do just be ever so slightly careful with the elaborate date formats. Try to reserve those for, I guess, final reports rather than for things you're going to be calculating with. Now we've just seen that Excel has a function called year which will extract the year component of a date. We've also got functions called month and day which extract the month and the day components, but VBA has its own versions of those functions as well, all called exactly the same thing. Let's just have another quick little subroutine please. Let's have a new sub called date parts, and we can similarly copy and paste some of the lines from the previous procedure. Let's copy the variable declaration in the worksheet.add and the range a1.value equals. So if we copy that out, paste it into this new procedure, and all I'd like to do to start with is set the range a1's value to be the year of the date. And then I can just copy and paste that line and change the cell references. So we've got A2 and A3. This might all be quite boring. You may well know all this already, and it's not particularly exciting, I admit, but it's all sort of the groundwork for some of the more complex things you might want to be doing with dates. There's also a function which will put together various separate date parts into a single continuous date. So let's have one more line, and what this is going to do is say range a4.value equals, and then it's going to be we're going to use a function there called date serial. So there's a function called date serial, which, if I were to open some parentheses, tells you it needs a year and a month and a day component to build a complete date. So what I can do here simply is copy and paste. The range A1 has the year, range A2 has the month, and range A3 has the day. So having done all that, I can then simply run that subroutine using the F5 key, and we'll hopefully see that we get the separated out parts of the date, the year and the month and the day, and then finally you've got the date reconstructed as the 2nd of May 2017. Let's move on and look at some of the other basic calculations we can perform with dates in VBA. I've just done a bit of tidying up in the workbook. I've deleted all the worksheets except for sheet 1. And what I'd like to do in here is put in a date sometime in the future, some date that we can calculate how many days it is until. So let's go with the traditional one in the UK. We'll go for Christmas Day. How many shopping days is it until Christmas, and that sort of thing. So I'm going to change the date in that cell to the 25th of the 12th, 2017. And what I'd like to do at that point is calculate some values associated with that date. So let's switch back into the VB editor, and I'm going to insert a new module for this, and then let's have a simple subroutine in here called basic date calculations. So I'll say basic date calculations. One of the simplest calculations you can perform with two dates is work out the difference between them, and you can do that simply by subtracting one date from another in a very basic fashion. So let's have a couple of variables just to demonstrate this. Let's say dim start date as date, and we'll also have end date as date. I'm going to set the end date to be the value of cell A1, so we might want to modify that later on. And the start date is simply going to be today's date. So let's say start date equals date, and also end date equals sheet1.range a1.value. I'll get there eventually, typing it in, there we go, .value. Okay, so to work out the difference between those two dates, I'd like to put the value into a cell in the worksheet. Let's say range A2. So I'm going to say range A2 .value equals end date minus start date. So all dates are just numbers in VBA and in Excel and, well, computing in general, or certainly most of the systems that I've ever used. So if a date is just a number, you can work out the difference between them by subtracting one from the other. So if I were to run that one, we'll end up with, if I use the F5 key, we'll end up with 237 days until Christmas. Now VBA does actually have a function designed purely for calculating the difference between dates. You may have encountered it in other systems. The function is called dateDiff. So rather than just subtracting one date from another date, what we could also do is use the dateDiff function. It's a little more complex to use, and for this simple example it might just be well worth subtracting one date from another. But if I just copy and paste that line and then replace the line with range a3.value equals, then there's a dateDiff function native to VBA. So the dateDiff function has effectively three compulsory parameters. The first parameter is which interval of time, which unit of time are you interested in. So if we want to know how many days it is until Christmas, then I can type in a set of double quotes the letter D. If I wanted months, I could go for M's and so on. There are various other options available there. If I typed in a comma, let's go for start date, so you go with the earliest date first, and then the third parameter will be the end date, so the final date we're interested in. So if I were to execute that subroutine at that point, then I'll see that I get the exact same answer in cell A3. Now one of the advantages of using the dateDiff function is it's slightly more convenient to test for different units of time, as we saw with this first parameter, the interval parameter. So let's have another couple of lines, let's have a couple of copies of this one, and if I change the cell references, so we're looking at cells A4 and A5, then we can change the units we're looking for to different increments. So let's say rather than days we'll go for weeks, so that's 2 W's, and then let's say for months we'll go for M. And then what I can do, if you want to see the full list available, by the way, the simplest thing to do is just get help on the dateDiff function. If you clicked on the word dateDiff and pressed the F1 key, that will take you away to the correct website, which will show you the list of all the different intervals of time you have available. So you'll get the dateDiff function help page, and then the list of options is available down there. So back to my VB editor and Excel, and let's just run that subroutine one more time using the F5 key, and I'll see that it's 237 days or 34 weeks or 7 months as it turns out. Now although VBA has a handful of useful datetime functions such as dateDiff, it doesn't have anywhere near like the number and variety available to Excel itself. Excel has a great big range of different datetime functions. So just looking at the Formulas tab in Excel's ribbon, there's a separate date and time section, and there are many more functions in this list than VBA itself has available. One particularly useful one would be net work days, so the number of working days between two dates rather than just the number of whole days between two dates. Sadly, VBA doesn't have its own version of that function, but it can reference Excel's version of that function. So just heading back to the VB editor, if I wanted to calculate the number of work days until Christmas, then I can copy and paste that line again. Let's just change this to range A6, and to access any of Excel's worksheet functions, then you'll want the worksheet function property. So I say worksheet function dot net workdays. Now sadly you don't get as much help when you reference these functions in VBA compared to how you see them listed in Excel, but if you need any help then just use Excel's formula wizard to get the help on those. What I'm going to do here is just enter the two dates I'm interested in, so that's going to be start date and end date. And then once again, if I were to execute that subroutine one more time, I'll end up with, that sounds better, 170 work days rather than 237 total days until Christmas. Just thinking back to the dateDiff function again, one common reason you're going to encounter this is to calculate the difference in years between two dates. So let me just do a quick separate example of this. If I create another quick subroutine called calculate years difference, something along those lines. What I'm going to do there is create a start date and an end date variable. So in fact I'm just going to cheat and copy and paste some of these lines of code there. So let's copy and paste those. And then this time I'd like my end date to be today's date. I'd like my start date to be a specific date. Let's imagine, let's say for the sake of argument, I was born on the 1st of January 1990. I wasn't, sadly, it was much earlier than that, but there we go. So the 1st of Jan 1990. And what I'm then going to do is calculate the difference in years between that date and today's date. So I'm going to use my date time function. Let's just debug.print this rather than write this out into cells in the worksheet so you can see what I'm trying to demonstrate here. Debug.print, and then I'm just going to copy and paste a date diff calculation. And to calculate the difference in years, that's 4 y's between the start date and the end date. And if I were to execute that, that would tell me that currently I would be 27 years old, as indeed today's date is in 2017. Okay, so let's imagine that I was born not on the 1st of Jan 1990. Let's say that I was born on, let's say, the 5th of May. So I'm going to change the 1 and 1 to 5 and 5. So if I were to run that one this time, the result of the formula still tells me that I'm 27, and I'm not yet. If I was born on that date, I'm not 27 for another 3 days. So this is one small limitation of the VBA date diff function. When you ask for the difference in years, it doesn't look for the entire date, it looks purely at the difference between that number there, 1990, and that number there, 2017. And the difference between those 2 years is 27. Now there are several different solutions to this sort of a problem, depending on exactly which system you're working in. But one simple convenient way to solve this issue in Excel is to use Excel's own version of the date diff function. Now you may well not be familiar with the date diff function in Excel, as opposed to VBA. It's spelled differently, and it used to be an undocumented function. Let me just quickly show you, see if I can show you what I mean by that. If I clicked into a cell in the worksheet and said equals date diff, you'll see that date diff doesn't appear in the IntelliSense list. However, if I persevere and type in date diff, spelt with a single F rather than 2 Fs in Excel, and then open up some parentheses, you'll see that date diff does pop up in the list. Now, depending on which version of Excel you're using, I happen to be using Excel 2016. I can't remember which version of Excel this was introduced in, but Excel used to contain absolutely no documentation about the date diff function whatsoever. As of the later versions of Excel, so 2016 certainly, if I clicked on this little hyperlink here for date diff, I do actually get some help. There is some documentation for the date diff function, which is really handy. The order of the parameters is slightly different. Let me just hit escape to abandon typing that in so I can scroll down. The order of the parameters is different. It's start date, end date, and then unit or interval of time. And the units are slightly different in the Excel's date diff function compared to VBA's as well. So it's a single Y for the number of complete years. So one of the nice things about Excel's date diff is it does only calculate complete years, not the overall difference in years between 2 dates. So to use that, the other problem that I've got as well, sadly, is that because, as you saw, date diff doesn't appear in this list here, it also doesn't appear in the worksheet function list in VBA, which is a little bit of a pain if I want to use it in VBA. So what I can do instead, let me show you the solution to this. If I say debug.print, there's a function in VBA called evaluate. And what the evaluate function does is it allows you to pass in effectively a string of text, which can then be evaluated in the VBA engine, and then it will return the results to you. So what I can do is enter in a set of double quotes the date diff function, and then open up some parentheses. Now the problem that I've got here is I need to be sort of referring to formulae and values in the worksheet. I can't refer to variable names in VBA. That's one slightly awkward thing about this. But if I set my start date to be cell A1 on this particular sheet, so I'm going to say date diff A1, comma, then I want to use today's date, so I'm going to use the today function as the end date, and then finally I'll need to enter or refer to the letter Y to get the number of years. Now I don't know if you can see here that the Y needs to be enclosed in double quotes, and that's another issue for me in VBA, because if I tried to type in some double quotes wrapped around the letter Y, this isn't going to work. What would happen is Excel would think that I'd ended this set of double quotes here, so that's one piece of text, then I've started the letter Y there, then I've begun another string of text here. So the solution to that is to enter double quotes, basically to wrap up the letter Y in a single set of double quotes. All very awkward, lots of places that this can go wrong. Finally then I can close the double quotes to contain that entire thing that I want to evaluate, and then close the extra set of round brackets right at the end. And finally, if I were just to change the date in here to the 5th of the 5th, 1990, just so I got the value typed in somewhere sensible in the worksheet, and if I were to execute this subroutine one more time, I'll find out that finally date diff VBA's version gives me 27, the evaluate function using date diff in Excel's version gives me 26, which is exactly what I wanted. Now, although this technique does work, it's not particularly elegant, is it? And it's prone to a few limitations as well. I've got to be working in Excel VBA in order to use the dateDiff function. It's also awkward to reference the values of variables in my VBA code. It works much more neatly if I refer to cell references. What I'd have to do is refer to my variables in such a way that I could write out the date into the final string expression to allow that to be interpreted properly. So because of all those limitations, what's worthwhile doing, or what's worthwhile thinking about if you're likely to be calculating age in years frequently, is writing your own custom function to do so. So let's have a new procedure down at the bottom of this module. It's going to be a function rather than a subroutine, and I'm going to call it age in years. I'd like my function to have two separate parameters, both passed in by val, so that they don't affect the values that have been passed into them in the calling procedure. So let's say by val start date as date, and then we'll also have by val end date as date. If you're interested more in what by val means, we have another video in this series that explains the difference between by val and by ref, which is the default, but hopefully you're familiar with that enough by now. We've done it enough times in this series. So we'll have by val end date as date. I'd like the function to return an integer, so I'm just going to say as integer, and that's the basic definition of my function created. Now, I'd also like to make the end date parameter optional and assume that if I didn't pass in a value to that parameter, that the end date would be treated as today's date. So in order to make a parameter optional, then you can simply add the word optional in front of the parameter's name. Again, this is a technique we've used in previous videos in the series. You can also assign a default value to parameters, and to do that, ordinarily what you would do is type in an equal sign at the end and then assign the constant value that you want. Now sadly, because I want to return today's date, that's not a constant. Today's date is something that changes, and I can't add expressions to default values for parameters. So I'm going to have to take that or approach that and solve that problem in a slightly different way. And the way I'm going to do that is in the function itself. So if you remember when you first begin a procedure that uses date variables, in fact if I just use the F8 key to begin stepping through this subroutine, you can see that date variables begin with a default value of effectively 0 but formatted as a unit of time, so hours, minutes and seconds. So what I could do here is I could check in my function if end date equals 0. If I can spell end date properly, that would have a greater chance of working. So if end date equals 0, then I'm going to set end date, and I've done it again, then end date equals date. So that's that first basic problem solved. Now the technique I'm going to use to calculate the age in years is fairly basic, but it helps you to explain what happens at each different stage. So let's start by declaring a couple of variables. I'm going to say dim years diff as integer. Then I'm also going to say dim anniversary as date. So the first thing I'm going to calculate after I've worked out the default value for the end date parameter, assuming that I've missed one out, is I'm going to calculate the difference in years between the start date and the end date. And the way I'm going to do that is using the dateDiff function that we used in the previous example. So let's just copy that and then say yearsDiff equals, and then paste that in to give us the difference in years between those two dates. The next step is to calculate the anniversary date of somebody whose birth date or whose start date was the date we passed in. So for example, if I calculated that the start date was the 5th of May 1990, and yearsDiff has calculated that the difference in years was 27, what I would like to do is effectively add 27 years onto the start date to give me the same date in this year. So I'm going to add 27 years to the 5th of May 1990. That will give me the 5th of May 2017. So, to do that I'm going to say anniversary equals, then another useful function in VBA is called dateAdd. So if I say dateAdd, open up some parentheses, the first parameter is interval again, so it's essentially the same as for dateDiff, so that's going to be 4y's, followed by the number of those intervals that I would like to add. That's whatever number is currently stored in the yearsDiff function, so I can say yearsDiff. Finally, I need to say which date I want to add that number of years onto. So I want to add that number of years onto the start date to give me the anniversary in this year. The next thing I need to do is calculate whether the anniversary date has happened yet, because if the anniversary has not yet happened in this current year, then the dateDiff function has returned the wrong answer. It's one too many. So what I'm going to do here is use another if statement to check if anniversary is greater than the end date that I passed in. If that's true, then what I would like to do is subtract 1 from the year's diff result. So let's say year's diff equals year's diff minus 1. So that will return the correct result if my anniversary hasn't happened. If my anniversary has already happened, then I don't need to do anything. So year's diff was actually the correct answer. All I've got to do now is return the result to the function. So to do that, I can write in the function name, age in years, and I can make this equal to year's diff. Okay, so all that remains at this point is to give the function a quick test. Probably the easiest way to do that is to use the previous subroutine. I've just cleared the contents of the immediate window by selecting all the text and hitting the delete key. Let's have a quick extra debug.print statement in here. So let's start by saying debug.print. We'll go with age in years. And then I'm going to pass in just the start date. So the start date in this procedure was the 5th of May 1990. So let's go with start date. I don't need to pass in the end date. You can see that that's an optional parameter, so I'm going to omit that for the time being. And then if I were to run that subroutine, I should end up with the correct answer for both evaluate and age in years, and the incorrect answer for date diff, because my birthday, my anniversary, hasn't yet happened in this year. So I hit the F5 key to run that. I get 27 for date diff. I'm reported as 1 year too old, and then I get the correct answer for the other two. I can modify this in a couple of different ways, so I can specify the exact end date, so I could just pass in the date function, and then again if I run that one again using the F5 key, it will still return the correct result, 27, 26, 26, and just clear the contents of the immediate window there. I could also pass in a different date altogether, so let's remove the date function and use a set of hash marks to pass in a specific date. Let's say I wanted to test the result as of, let's say let's go for the 5th of February, I don't know, 2002. So I'm going to go for the 5 Feb 2002. So in 2002, the person born on the 5th of May 1990 will become 12 years old. But until the 5th of May, that person will still be 11 years old, of course. So this should return the result of 11. If I use the F5 key to run it, 27, 26, 11. As soon as I hit the 5th of May, however, for that year, if I hit 5th of May that year, that person will become 12. So there we go. So there's another option. It's a little bit more long-winded, of course, to write out your own custom function, but at least you're more confident in exactly what the result is going to be if you do it yourself. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseR website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching. See you next time.